In our final video of the urinary system, we're going to learn about the final regulatory hormone specifically responsible for regulating the reabsorption of water from the nephron into the blood, and that hormone is what we call antidiuretic hormone, known by the short form ADH. Now, from this, we can derive the actual purpose of the hormone. If we look at the root of this word, we can see the medical condition diarrhea, which refers to a loss of water in the digestive system. For example, when you defecate and lose an inordinate amount of water, this is what we call diarrhea. So naturally, antidiuretic hormone is a hormone that has the function of preventing diarrhea by helping to reabsorb water into the blood and stop it from being lost. Antidiuretic hormone also has a second name by which it is known, which is called vasopressin, and again, this gives us a hint about what its function is. From the suffix, we can see that the word pressure is the root form of this word, and vaso, from which we can connect it to the word vascular, referring to the tubes that transport liquid, including our blood vessels, which tells us that antidiuretic hormone is instrumental in regulating blood pressure. Now, based on this, it should come as no surprise that one of the stimuli that upregulates the production of antidiuretic hormone is the same as aldosterone, a low blood pressure, and this should come as no surprise, not just given the name, but because blood pressure is based on the amount of water that exists within the blood. The more water there is, the higher the blood pressure is, because the more force the liquid exerts on the insides of the blood vessels, and therefore if we have a low amount of water, that corresponds to not as much volume of the blood, and therefore a low blood pressure that needs to be rectified. Now, just like with aldosterone as well, the regulatory hormone for glomerular filtration, that being angiotensin, is also a stimulus that leads to the production of antidiuretic hormone. Now, as to the details about how and where it is produced, due to the fact that antidiuretic hormone has functions outside of the nephrons, it is produced in the hypothalamus, of course, the primary regulatory organ of the endocrine system, and once ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, has been produced, it is released and stored in the pituitary gland, where it is stored until the appropriate stimulus is given to release it. Now, once again, this stimulus can either come from angiotensin, which, if it makes its way through the blood all the way back up to the pituitary gland, when it binds to the appropriate receptor in the pituitary gland, it signals the pituitary to release antidiuretic hormone into the bloodstream, where it can then travel down to the kidneys and cause the effects that it is going to cause. Now, similarly to aldosterone, blood pressure is recognized by specific sensory neurons, which are what we call pressure sensors, that exist within the arteries of the bloodstream, and their job is to detect a low volume of water, which again leads to a low blood pressure, and therefore use the nervous system to send a signal to the pituitary gland to then release antidiuretic hormone into the bloodstream. Either one of these stimuli will lead to ADH migrating through the blood and binding to an appropriate receptor protein that is found, once again, on the collecting duct, as the function of the collecting duct is the final decision maker in terms of maintaining the balance between salt and water in urine and the blood. Now, as we know, because of water's polarity, water does not have the ability to cross the membrane by itself without the aid of a transport protein, and that channel protein that specifically transports water is what we call aquaporin. Now, one of the functions of antidiuretic hormone is to send a signal from the surface of the membrane to the nucleus of the cell, because inside of the nucleus, antidiuretic hormone can upregulate the DNA that is responsible for producing aquaporin, the transport protein. However, one of the other effects is much simpler. A lot of the time, aquaporin, because of the necessity of cells to import and export water, extra aquaporin proteins are actually stored on vesicles that exist within cells within the collecting duct. And what ADH does is it sends a signal to these vesicles, causing them to migrate to the cell membrane and undergo the process of exocytosis. Now, when these vesicles undergo exocytosis, which seems a little bit odd because there's basically nothing in these vesicles, because what we're interested in are the channel proteins that are on the surface, but because vesicles are made of cell membrane, their membranes join with the surface of the cell of the collecting duct, and aquaporin is now present on the surface of the membrane, allowing water to osmose further into the collecting duct cell. Now, in terms of the conditions that led to this, remember that low blood pressure, which is caused primarily by a low water volume in our blood, is one of the primary stimuli to produce antidiuretic hormone. Now, if this is true, if we have a low blood volume, that must mean, by contrast, that we would expect to have a high solute volume like this, meaning that our blood is hypertonic relative to our urine. So if our urine is hypotonic because it has more water in it compared to the blood, the natural direction that water would move is from the urine in the collecting duct into the blood. And all that we need to facilitate this change is more transport protein, aquaporin, on the surface of the collecting duct cells. So as a consequence of more transport proteins allowing water to move this way, the osmotic pressure, that being the force of water osmosing into the blood, is naturally going to increase as water enters the bloodstream, causing the blood volume to increase as well, thereby leading to an increase in blood pressure, normalizing it. And as with the shutoff system, in many cases with regulatory hormones, now our stimulus of low blood pressure is no longer present. And because the pressure sensors inside of your arteries detect that we no longer have low blood pressure, this removes one of the stimuli, thereby sending a negative feedback signal to the hypothalamus to shut down ADH production, because we have fixed the issue. So the overall mechanism behind how this works, while being similar to aldosterone in that both aldosterone and antidiuretic hormone lead to an increased transport of water from the urine into the blood, but they do so in entirely different ways, where aldosterone creates the hypertonic situation in the blood through the transport of sodium ions into the blood. ADH regulates this process by increasing the ability of water to pass from the collecting duct into circulation by upregulating the production of the transport protein that is necessary for this. And in the end, both hormones have the same effect of increasing the volume of water within blood, thereby increasing blood pressure and creating an isotonic balance between the urine in the collecting duct and the liquid within the blood. This concludes our series not just on regulatory hormones of the urinary system, but the urinary system itself. To test your knowledge of how aldosterone and antidiuretic hormone function to regulate urine production, you can take a look first at this case study here that examines what goes wrong when aldosterone production is affected by a disease causing the feedback cycle to become imbalanced. And when you're done with that, take a look at the practice problems that follow it to test your knowledge, not just of the urinary system, but in hormonal regulation of it.